August 1950. A grey dawn crawls over the hills near the Naktong River. Smoke hangs low, drifting like torn fabric above the charred ridgelines. Beneath that pall, an M26 Pershing sits half buried in mud, its armor streaked with soot, its gun barrel trembling from the last shot. Inside, 5 men breathe in short bursts, the smell of oil, blood, and cordite thick enough to taste. The radio crackles, half words, half static. Someone coughs. Someone whispers a prayer. Outside, the world groans like a wounded machine. Across the field, the hulks of T-34 tanks, Soviet-built, North Korean crude, smolder under a rising sun. Their steel hides blister in the heat, turrets twisted open like scorched fruit. For weeks, these dark shapes had seemed invincible, roaring through villages and rice fields, unstoppable metal beasts carrying the Red Star into the south. The Americans had called them phantoms of the East, ghosts born from Stalin's factories, and even the toughest Marines spoke their name with unease. But now, as the Pershing crew watches the ridge they'd once fled, something shifts. The young gunner, Private Donnelly, stares through the periscope, seeing not victory, but disbelief. He remembers the laughter of captured North Koreans who said, "Your tanks are toys." He remembers the sound of their T-34 shells punching through everything the US had thrown at them in the first month of war. Yet here, on this battered hill, the tide had changed. From the mud, a new sound begins to rise, the slow whine of a Pershing's engine as it powers up again, ready for another round. The machine breathes like a living thing, iron lungs filled with vengeance and courage. Somewhere above the noise, the sergeant mutters, "They thought we were running. Not today." Before we move deeper into this forgotten story, subscribe to POW Tales, where real history speaks. The Pershing's treads grind forward, dragging the sun's reflection over its armor as the narrator's voice drops to a whisper, the beginning of a war within a war. The smoke clears just enough to reveal the ridgeline of the Naktong River, and with it, the history that led these men here. The Korean Peninsula, June 1950, a place where dawn comes early, and war came even earlier. When North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel, their Soviet-supplied T-34-85 tanks cut through the hills like steel thunder. Civilians fled south as those hulking silhouettes rolled past burning villages, their engines echoing through valleys once filled with rice paddies and songs. To many in the West, the Korean War was supposed to be a police action, but for the soldiers on the ground, it was a brutal clash of eras. The Americans had not faced such armor since World War II. Most of the early US units stationed in Japan had been occupation forces, lightly equipped, undertrained, and unprepared for a full mechanized onslaught. When those first T-34s appeared near Osan, their thick frontal armor shrugged off bazooka rounds like pebbles. Infantrymen watched their shells bounce and scatter, useless against Soviet craftsmanship that had once faced the Wehrmacht. Panic spread. The few Sherman tanks available, M4A3s left over from World War II, were outgunned and outmatched, their 75mm guns barely scratching the T-34's hide. Reports from the front read like obituaries. Enemy armor impervious to current weapons. Recommend retreat. At first, commanders thought it was exaggeration, until photographs of burning US columns began arriving in Tokyo. General Douglas MacArthur, operating from his headquarters there, was forced to admit what his staff already knew. American forces were being driven into the sea. The US scrambled for answers. From depots in the Pacific, they pulled out the heaviest machines still serviceable, the M26 Pershing, a tank once built to fight tigers in Europe. It had been considered too slow, too fuel-hungry for Korea's mountainous terrain. But desperation had no patience for doctrine. Within weeks, Pershings were loaded onto ships bound for Busan, each one a gamble that America's forgotten heavyweight could turn back a red tide. On the docks, crews who had never seen combat with tanks were handed the Pershings and told simply, "You'll figure it out." The engines coughed, the tracks groaned, and the men inside began to learn the language of steel under fire. Every mile north they traveled brought new wrecks, Shermans still smoking, jeeps half buried in ash. At night, they could hear the distant rumble of T-34s advancing, like thunder rolling closer. By late August 1950, the Naktong River became the fragile backbone of American defense, the last line before Busan. Every bridge, every bend in the river was turned into a fortress of desperation. The North Koreans, confident in their Soviet-made armor, hurled T-34 columns against the line day and night. The ground shook as if the earth itself wanted to surrender. In those first days, U.S. infantry units were shattered by the speed and precision of the North Korean advance. The T-34s led every charge, spearheads of iron, followed by waves of infantry. They would appear through morning fog, firing point-blank at foxholes and dugouts. Some American platoons held their fire until they could see the glint of the tank commander's goggles, then watched helplessly as their rounds ricocheted off sloped armor. But the arrival of the M26 Pershing began to shift the rhythm of war. These machines, towering, heavy, and snarling with power, were the answer to the T-34's arrogance. With a 90mm gun capable of piercing 7 inches of armor, they were not just tanks, but judgments cast in steel. Yet for the crews, that power came with weight, literally and psychologically. Corporal Fred Blake, a Pershing loader from the 1st Marine Tank Battalion, wrote in his field diary, now preserved in the Marine Corps archives, "We didn't trust her yet. Too slow for the hills, too hot in the cabin. But the first time we saw a T-34 burn, every man just stared. You could feel her heartbeat through the floor." Those first duels near Masan were chaotic. The Pershings would lumber into position, their massive turrets turning like predators hunting through smoke. The first T-34s they met came charging down a road lined with broken telegraph poles. One Pershing gunner fired. The shell hit low, tore through the tank's underbelly, and blew the turret clean off. For the first time, U.S. soldiers saw that the T-34 could bleed. From that moment, something intangible shifted in the ranks. Rumors spread quickly across units. The new tanks can kill them. Morale began to return, as if the Pershing carried not just shells, but belief. Still, victory was far from secure. Supplies ran low. Maintenance was hell in the Korean mud. Every mile forward meant another engine failure, another tank stripped for parts. But as more Pershings arrived, the once invincible T-34s began to falter. Their crews, once fearless, now hesitated before crossing open ground. What began as a rout slowly became a contest, a test between Soviet design and American adaptation, between numbers and nerve. And deep in that contest, under the constant roar of artillery and the grind of tracks, the young Pershing crews began to shed their fear and become something harder. The hills ahead would soon teach them what it meant to face an enemy that refused to break, an enemy that believed sheer numbers could still crush steel and will alike. September 1950. The nights near the Naktong turned blacker than oil, and the air smelled of spent powder and burning paint. The front had become a maze of wrecked machines, shattered trees, and cratered roads where the lines between friend and foe blurred in the smoke. The Pershing crews were learning fast, but every lesson came with a cost. Inside Tank 23, call sign Annie Bell. Sergeant John Mac McAllister wiped grime from the gun sight with a rag darkened by soot. His gunner, Donnelly, sat hunched over the optics, whispering range estimates to himself. Their engine rattled like a dying heart. The tank's armor was pitted with shrapnel scars from near misses that felt far too close. Above them, flares hissed across the night sky, revealing a nightmare landscape. Fields littered with burning T-34s, but also Pershings left smoldering, their crews lost in the inferno. The North Koreans were not retreating quietly. Each night, they regrouped, pushing columns of tanks and infantry through hidden trails in the hill. They believed in the same doctrine that had carried them south, overwhelm the Americans with numbers, weight, and relentless courage. And for a time, it worked. One evening, a forward position near Hill 303 was overrun when 8 T-34s came through the mist like ghosts. U.S. lines crumbled. Radio calls turned to static and screams. "We can't see a thing," Donnelly shouted as tracer fire cut through the darkness. The Pershing's main gun barked, a flash that lit the cabin like lightning. Through the periscope, Mac watched a T-34 stagger under the impact, fire bursting from its turret ring. The crew didn't celebrate. There was no cheering now, only breathing, hard and fast, the sound of men who'd learned that victory and survival were the same word. Every duel was personal. Each Pershing faced tanks built by men they'd never meet. Soviet engineers who had mastered war metal a decade earlier. It was like fighting ghosts of a war that had never ended. Mac often wondered, as he loaded another shell, if those same designers imagined their work would someday kill Americans in a country they couldn't find on a map. In the chaos, the motif of fire through iron became literal. The battlefield was no longer green or brown. It glowed red-orange at night, molten streaks running down tank hulls like veins of lava. Men spoke of it in half-mad poetry. "The hills are bleeding iron," one corporal wrote home, "and the air smells like hell's workshop." But amid that furnace, something else hardened. The Pershing crew's resolve. They learned to move slower, to use terrain, to strike from ambush. They started to fight like the terrain itself, patient, punishing, and unyielding. Still, even as the Americans adapted, the North Koreans dug in deeper, sending wave after wave across the Naktong's bends. It wasn't just a battle for ground now, it was a contest of will, of who would break first under fire. By mid-September, the Naktong bulge had become a furnace of attrition. The earth was torn open by shell fire, and the smell of diesel mixed with rot and ash. Each hill changed hands so often that even commanders stopped naming them. For the tank crews, there was no front, only the next ridge, the next village, the next ambush. Inside Annie Bell, Sergeant Mac McAllister felt his world shrinking. He no longer thought of battles in days, only in shells fired and miles survived. The tank's metal walls became both prison and sanctuary. Sleep was stolen in seconds, meals reduced to cold rations eaten between bombardments. The men stopped shaving, they stopped joking. Their faces were as grey as the smoke that wrapped the valley. The North Koreans kept coming, infantry charging behind their T-34s, shouting war cries that echoed through the ravines. Each assault was meant to drown the defenders in sheer volume, and sometimes it nearly worked. A night near Yongsan, 3 T-34s broke through an American line, scattering jeeps and trucks. Max Pershing was the only tank between them and a retreating battalion. He ordered Donnelly to hold fire until the first T-34 crested the ridge. The ground trembled, heavy tracks grinding closer. Through the gun sight, Mac could see the red star painted bright against the moonlight. "Now," he said. The Pershing's cannon roared. The shell slammed through the T-34's front plate, punching a hole the size of a door. The explosion lit the night. The next T-34 fired back. Its shot screamed past, striking a rock face and showering them with debris. Mac's loader rammed another shell home, hands blistered. They fired again. A perfect hit. One by one, the enemy tanks burned, silhouettes dancing in the infernal glow. When the noise faded, Mac realized his hands were trembling. He looked around. Everyone inside Annie Bell was silent. The radio buzzed, a voice breaking through. "Good shooting. You just saved a company." But the words felt hollow. Each kill left its own scar. Max scribbled in his pocket notebook later that night, "We keep burning them down, but they just keep coming. Feels like killing the same tank over and over, like it's learning nothing, just dying in different places." It was a haunting truth that the North Koreans' strength lay not in armor, but in conviction. They still believed that numbers could smother technology, that endless courage could melt steel. The Pershing crews knew otherwise, but knowing didn't make surviving easier. As dawn broke, the Pershing's hull steamed in the cool air, streaked with soot and dew. The men inside sat wordless, their silhouettes framed by the faint orange glow on the horizon. They had endured another night, but their faces said what no report could. Survival was no victory. Not yet. Ahead lay weeks of endless patrols, mechanical breakdowns, and the slow grind of routine that would test their humanity even more than battle itself. By October 1950, the war had settled into a punishing rhythm, one that stripped men down to their habits, their fears, and their stubbornness. The great sweeping battles of the early months had given way to skirmishes, patrols, and endless maintenance in mud that swallowed boots and souls alike. For the tankers of the 1st Marine Tank Battalion, routine meant a kind of exhaustion that lived in the bones. Each morning began the same. The mist would still hang low over the paddies, the distant crackle of artillery echoing like a sick heartbeat. Mac's crew would crawl from under their tarp beside Annie Bell, faces smeared with grease, uniforms stiff with dried sweat. Breakfast was coffee-laced with gun oil and hardtack that tasted like gravel. Then came the ritual, checking the Pershing. Oil levels, tracks, treads, barrel alignment. She was their lifeline, and keeping her alive was as sacred as prayer. When not in combat, they fixed everything they could with what little they had. The supply lines were still unreliable, parts often scavenged from wrecked Shermans or stripped from Pershings, too damaged to move. Donnelly once joked, "We're fighting the Soviets with junkyard angels." Nobody laughed. Days blurred together. The hills were dry, cracked, and silent until night fell. Then they came alive with distant firefights and flares that painted the world in red and white. Between assignments, the crew played cards on the tank's hull, their laughter thin, almost forced. Someone would hum a tune from back home, something from the radio Glenn Miller, maybe, until the sound faded into the hum of diesel engines in the distance. Letters from home arrived rarely. When they did, they were read slowly, like scripture. Donnelly's wife wrote from Kansas, her words neat and full of normal life. "The corn's coming early this year, honey. Stay safe. I pray for you every morning." He kept that letter folded in his breast pocket, unreadable in the dark, but memorized all the same. Sometimes they talked about the T-34s. "They still think they can win," said Mac one night, staring into the fire. "They believe numbers can crush us." "And maybe they're right," replied the loader quietly, eyes on the horizon. "If they send enough of them." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. By now, every man in Annie Bell knew the Pershing's heartbeat. The subtle change in engine tone before a failure, the faint tremor before the recoil. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was something alive, something they both protected and feared. The sound of its engine became their lullaby, the warmth of its steel their only shelter from the biting Korean wind. But the routine, brutal and constant, was about to shatter. Reports came down the line. Reconnaissance had spotted a massing of North Korean armor near the ridges west of Yongsan, at least 20 T-34s with infantry support. It wasn't a rumor. The red tide was building again. The next dawn would test everything they'd learned, and everything they'd come to believe about steel, fire, and the limits of men. That night, the valley was unnervingly still. No artillery, no aircraft, no movement beyond the whisper of wind through shell-pocked trees. Mac could feel it, the kind of quiet that never lasted in Korea. He sat on the Pershing's turret, boots dangling, cigarette ember glowing like a tiny red star. Below him, Donnelly was checking the ammunition racks again, muttering numbers to himself. The loader, Corporal Ruiz, was asleep against the treads, using his helmet as a pillow. Even in sleep, his hands twitched, as if still loading shells. The M26 Pershing loomed over them, a black silhouette against the faint light of the moon. To the men who fought inside her, she was more than metal. She was a companion that could betray or save them with the same breath. Every clang, every vibration in the hull spoke a language they'd learned by heart. When she ran smoothly, they felt invincible. When she coughed or stalled, it felt like death brushing past the hatch. Morning came cold and pale. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust from warming engines as the battalion prepared to move. Command had ordered a defensive line along a narrow valley road leading into the mountains, a natural choke point where they hoped to halt the enemy armor before it reached the supply depots farther south. The plan was simple: let them come and then burn the valley down. By noon, Annie Bell and two other Pershings were positioned behind camouflaged ridges. Tank destroyers and artillery were set farther back, hidden among scrub and rocks. The crews waited in silence, helmets resting on their knees. Mac scanned the horizon through his binoculars, nothing but heat shimmer and dust. Hours passed. The men dozed in shifts, every nerve stretched thin by anticipation. Then, just before dusk, the rumble began. Distant at first, like thunder trapped underground. It grew louder, steadier, until the very earth vibrated. Through the haze, black shapes emerged, T-34s, dozens of them, moving in formation, their red stars barely visible beneath the grime. Infantry followed in waves, rifles glinting under the dimming light. Donnelly's hands trembled as he adjusted the sight. "They're really coming," he whispered. "Hold steady," Mac said. "Wait for them to cross the white rock. That's our marker." The first T-34 crossed it, oblivious to the trap. Mac lowered his hand. Fire! The Pershing roared. The 90mm shell screamed across the valley and struck dead center. The T-34 erupted in a pillar of flame. A second round followed, then a third. Within seconds, the entire valley lit up as artillery joined in, and the American line came alive in a symphony of thunder. For hours, it was chaos. Tanks burning, machine guns rattling, tracer fire streaking like comets. The Pershing crews fired until their barrels glowed red, the smell of burning rubber and flesh thick in the air. When it was finally over, the valley was a furnace of twisted metal and silent bodies. Max sat back in his seat, drenched in sweat, heart hammering. Numbers, he muttered. They really thought numbers could win. He didn't yet know that this battle, this night of fire, would mark the turning point of the Korean Tank War, where the myth of the invincible T-34 finally shattered under American steel and precision. When dawn broke, the smoke still hung over the valley like a fog of ghosts. The sun's first light revealed a battlefield painted in ash, the twisted hulks of T-34s smoldering beside shattered rocks, their tracks melted into the earth. Blackened silhouettes of rifles jutted from the ground, frozen mid-fall. The air stank of oil, sulfur, and scorched paint, the smell of victory and death fused into one. Inside Annie Bell, the crew was drained. Their uniforms were soaked through with sweat, their throats raw from shouting over the roar of engines. Donnelly's hands trembled as he wiped soot from the gun sight. "We burned a whole company," he whispered, disbelief and awe mixing in his tone. "They just kept coming." Mac didn't answer. He was looking at the horizon through the cracked periscope. For a brief second, he saw movement. A lone North Korean soldier, crawling from the wreck of a T-34, clutching a red flag. The man tried to lift it, then collapsed into the dirt. The flag fluttered weakly in the rising heat. It wasn't triumph that filled Mac's chest. It was something heavier. "War's a strange thing," he murmured. "You fight a man you've never met, and both of you think you're the hero." Nearby, a squad of infantry moved among the wrecks, checking for survivors. They waved up at the Pershing, giving a thumbs up. "Hell of a job, tankers," one shouted. But Mac didn't wave back. He knew what that kind of praise cost. Radio chatter crackled to life. Reports coming in from other sectors. Similar scenes played out across the front. Pershings and Shermans halting waves of T-34s, artillery cutting through massed assaults. The North Korean offensive had broken like glass against steel. The once unstoppable momentum of their invasion was slowing, finally meeting something they couldn't simply overrun: firepower, coordination, and American grit. Mac lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and leaned against the turret. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "They'll be back, but now they know what they're walking into." Above them, F-80 jets streaked overhead, chasing the rising smoke trails, guardians of a new kind of warfare. The ground crews cheered, and for a moment, the sound felt almost like peace. But in Korea, peace never lasted long. By late July, the tide had shifted. The M26 Pershings were no longer just defending ground. They were leading the charge northward. Convoys of olive-drab armor rolled through valleys that had once echoed with retreat. Now, it was the enemy who was running. Captain Mac's tank, Annie Bell, rumbled at the front of the column, its treads grinding over the burned-out carcasses of T-34s left from the last clash. The crew rode in silence, the adrenaline long replaced by a steady, grim focus. Each mile forward meant fewer friends lost and one step closer to pushing the North Koreans back beyond the 38th parallel. The counteroffensive was brutal. Hills had to be taken one at a time, each one a fortress of trenches and machine gun nests. The artillery screamed day and night, shaking the earth until even the stones seemed to cry out. When the infantry moved, the tanks followed, Pershings pounding at dugouts while mortars whistled overhead. One afternoon, as Annie Bell crested a ridge, Mac saw a scene that would stay with him for life. A North Korean column, hundreds strong, retreating through a narrow valley. Trucks, guns, soldiers scrambling. Command radioed a single word: fire. Mac hesitated for a heartbeat, then gave the order. The Pershing's cannon thundered, joined by dozens of others. The valley below erupted, explosions chained together like lightning, smoke and dust rising high enough to blot out the sky. Through the haze, the red flag of the North Korean army fell, swallowed by fire and silence. Donnelly exhaled shakily. "That's it, Cap. They're finished." Mac didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the valley. "Finished?" he muttered. "No, just men following orders, same as us." As the sun set behind the mountains, the Pershings rolled on, leaving behind a wasteland of iron and shadows. For the first time, it felt like victory might actually be possible. But Mac knew it was only the start of another chapter in a war that refused to end cleanly. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes never really stopped. When the ceasefires came and the Pershings were hauled back to depots for overhaul, Captain Mac and his crew found themselves standing in a world that seemed smaller, emptier than before. The hills they had fought over were stripped bare, soil blackened, rivers thick with ash, villages reduced to husks of concrete and wood. Yet in that destruction, the strange calm of survival took root. In the months that followed, Mac's tank platoon was stationed near the Pusan perimeter for rest and resupply. Soldiers wandered the camp like ghosts, their laughter hesitant, their habits shaped by the rhythm of battle that had defined every waking moment. Letters from home arrived by the dozen, many unopened. The men no longer spoke of heroism, only of the next sunrise, and the hope that it might bring something ordinary. Occasionally, trucks rolled in, carrying damaged T-34s, captured and rusting. Engineers examined them with fascination, measuring armor thickness, studying every dent and weld. Mac watched them work and thought of the nights when those machines had seemed invincible. Black silhouettes roaring through smoke, symbols of an enemy they barely understood. Now, they were just relics, empty shells. He took a walk one evening along a ridge overlooking the harbor. The Pershings sat in neat rows below, their hulls reflecting the faint orange of the setting sun. Children from nearby villages played among them. The very machines that had once brought death, now serving as strange monuments to peace. One little boy climbed onto Annie Bell's turret and saluted clumsily. Max smiled, a tired, broken smile that reached somewhere deep in his chest. War, he realized, wasn't about winners. It was about endurance, about what remained when the fire burned out. He thought of the enemy tankers, who had fought with equal courage, of the shattered ridges and the men buried beneath them. And though he couldn't explain it, a quiet respect grew, where hatred had once lived. Years later, when the newspapers called it a forgotten war, Mac would close his eyes and still see the valley lit by fire, the silhouettes of T-34s against a curtain of smoke, and the roar of the Pershing's gun echoing through the night. Forgotten? No. Some wars never leave you. They linger, in the smell of diesel, in the grit under your nails, in the faces of those who made it home. And when he finally retired his uniform, Mac left a single brass shell casing on his desk, polished clean, engraved with one word: remember. If this story moved you, subscribe to POW Tales, where every silence of war finds its voice again.